Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to my weekly podcast. I have to be honest here, I'm still coming down in a way from all the work that went into my first video project, the one that came out this past Monday. I really appreciate all the positive feedback and constructive criticism I've been getting for it. Right now, I'm experimenting with a couple of different audio editing features and a couple of changes to my recording process, so hopefully I'm sounding a little better now than I do in that video. Small steps, but when you've spent the better part of a decade building up an online presence that's carried entirely on the strength of your writing, it can take some getting used to working with other elements. That aside, though, I did want to take some time to build up a little hype. See, the Nintendo Direct at E3 was not terribly interesting to me personally, but if you're into Metroid or Advance Wars or are still eagerly anticipating Breath of the Wild 2, I'm happy for you. However, we are now only 2 weeks out from the Switch remaster of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, a game that I do very much anticipate, even despite the apparent lack of any substantial new features aside from some fast travel via Amiibo that I'm not going to bother with, because I'm not really into Amiibo, and also because I don't think Skyward Sword really needs a better fast travel system than what was in the original Wii version. We're talking about the most aggressively linear 3D Zelda here. It's not a big open world. And the most open area, namely the sky, is relatively small and light on content, closer to Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field than the ocean in Wind Waker, if we're making comparisons. And really, I think one of Skyward Sword's biggest strengths is that linearity, because it allows for a tightly structured playing experience that still doesn't feel completely on rails, because this is, after all, still a Zelda game and therefore still at least in part about exploration and optional side content. I'm fairly sure that's one of the reasons this game's story is often praised too, because it can take an admittedly formulaic plot structure and use it to build a sort of series creation myth, with a number of interesting and dynamic characters, at least by Zelda game standards, where you're usually lucky to get one standout member of the cast per game. Skyward Sword's got fan-favorite Groose, the best mainline title version of Impa ever, a pretty solid Zelda, campy villain Girahim who just skirts the line between badass and mildly offensive, and the miscellaneous denizens of Skyloft who just about equal the citizens of Majora's Mask Clocktown as wacky and occasionally interesting NPCs. Hell, even Fi has a small character arc even though she's functionally a magical AI, and who knows, if the remaster makes most of her unnecessary dialogue skippable and keeps her from popping up to halt your progress every 2 minutes, we might actually be able to appreciate that aspect of her. That's more or less what I'm expecting from the overall quality of this remaster too. That it does for Skyward Sword what the Wind Waker HD did for that game, and smooths over its various annoyances with quality of life improvements. I am unsurprisingly looking forward to playing the game without motion controls, less because I found the sword controls in the original frustrating, and more for all the other stuff that the game forced you to use them for. For those of you who played the original Skyward Sword, you can't tell me that the underwater swimming controls aren't abysmal, that flying isn't physically exhausting, that you didn't dread the harp-playing segments because of how unresponsive they were, or that even falling, of all things, wasn't a pain in the ass. For the most part, the game's sword combat and ranged weapon targeting were solid enough, and definitely improved from the Wii version of Twilight Princess for that matter, but it's everything else involving motion controls that drags the game down. Seriously, even the clever idea of turning the boss key of each dungeon into a puzzle is ruined by motion controls, because it uses the same unresponsive mechanics as the gyro-based shrines in Breath of the Wild, with similarly frustrating results. If the remaster can successfully map all that stuff to buttons in the analog stick, and cut down on some of the more intrusive elements like unnecessary item text and most of what Fi says, I think it'll have all the makings of a quality port. Assuming you like more linear Zelda adventures, Skyward Sword already has plenty to offer, and while even I'm willing to admit that there are parts where its story progression is a little heavy on the padding, I'm having a hard time imagining most of that being cut out without it negatively impacting something else. Like, we all know that the 3 imprisoned fights are repetitive and grind the game to a halt every time they appear, but they're also instrumental to Groose's character development, and everyone loves that, right? If they can only make it so you don't have to fight all 3 again in the boss rush, that'd be fine with me. Maybe they'll shorten that robot escort quest? That's one of the game's more obnoxious bits of padding, at least from what I can remember. It's relatively small tweaks like that that will determine the quality of this remaster, in my opinion. Because, yeah, I do think that Skyward Sword is a pretty good game apart from the mechanical and pacing issues that hold it back. It's a little strange for me to be drawing a conclusion like that, not just because the fandom likes to drag Skyward Sword all the time, but because I placed it pretty low, at least compared to the other 3D titles, on my ranking of all the games in the series a few years back. I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm going to be in this weird minority of fans that ends up preferring the improved Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, and potentially its sequel, and that's probably not going to be an easy position to take unless this remaster unexpectedly blows everyone away with how much better it is than the original, and or the next Zelda keeps getting delayed so much that fans get frustrated and lose interest. Fandom popularity aside, though, it's not that unusual of a concept, because if Breath of the Wild sits on one end of a spectrum of Zelda games, then Skyward Sword is its polar opposite. Much more so than Ocarina of Time, which is more typically the comparison there. It's very linear, very story-driven, and centers its action and puzzles largely at the expense of exploration. To put it another way, Breath of the Wild's dungeons feel more like an extension of content in its overworld, while in Skyward Sword, the entire world as a surface can feel like a series of interconnected dungeons. Which approach you prefer really does come down to personal taste, and I'm not going to claim that either is necessarily truer to what Zelda is quote-unquote supposed to be, when that's not all that important a concern for a series that's gone in so many different directions over the years. Putting aside the comparisons, though, I'm really looking forward to this remaster, because without its more annoying elements, Skyward Sword has the potential to be one of my favorite 3D Zeldas. I love the colorful art style, the tight structure, the fun characters, the solid dungeon design, and even the divine pageant angle the story goes with, because I know that's off-putting for some people to imply that Ganondorf was always predestined to be evil, but I look at it this way. A man rescuing a woman from a monster is this painfully obvious relic of video game excuse plots from the 1980s, and if Nintendo is going to keep returning to that well for two of its biggest series, I'd rather that the more plot-driven one have some kind of in-universe justification for that, as opposed to just saying, well, it's what everyone was doing in the 80s. Skyward Sword delivers on that, and unexpectedly does so with a fair amount of probably unintentional kink too, thanks to everything Girahim and Demise have going on in their relationship. But on that note, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Thanks to everyone for listening, and thanks especially to my patrons over on Patreon who keep me extra motivated to work on new content. I personally always thought it sounds a little tacky when YouTubers are constantly telling their viewers to like and subscribe, but if you enjoy my content and are interested in more, you can go ahead and do that. I certainly won't complain. I've been enjoying getting to build up this channel, and if there's enough interest in video essays like the last one, I'd be happy to look into other subjects that I think may warrant a more in-depth and visually stimulating discussion. Have a good day, everyone. Au revoir.